I'm Colin Sanders, and my great aim in life is to review the whole of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, chapter by chapter. I am now just over halfway through, and I find myself in what is today northern Turkey. The period is the middle of the 6th century, and the Byzantines under Justinian are tussling with the Persians under Khosrow. There are some regions that are very important for describing what goes on in this part of the world that aren't very familiar to most of us. I'm rather doubtful that they were in Gibbon's time, but he assumes a lot of knowledge on the part of the reader, and I suppose he knew them better than I do. But whatever, I'll try and unpick it all. Colchis is the region at the bottom right hand of the Black Sea. Today it corresponds to the northeast area of Turkey and to the state of Georgia. This is a region that is much in the news, and the broadcasts are usually confusing to those of us who don't know that area well. There seem to be all sorts of peoples mentioned: Kurds, Turks, Syrians, Yazidis, to mention just a few. There are also various religions at work. In fact, what we see on the news is way oversimplified, and this whole region consists of all sorts of ethnic groups with all kinds of different cultures. There are a couple of language groups that are unique to this part of the world that have no relationship to any other anywhere on the planet. The origins of all this diversity go back a very long way indeed, and it is fair to assume that a lot of them predate history, let alone Roman history. Colchis as a kingdom repelled an attack by one of the pharaohs of Egypt during the Bronze Age. It is quite remarkable to think that an Egyptian army that early was operating so far from home at all, but there you have it. The Persians succeeded where the Egyptians failed, but did not directly incorporate Colchis into their empire, but set it up with its own king as a satellite state. It was conquered by Alexander the Great, and later formed a large part of the kingdom of Pontus, ruled by Mithridates, who was defeated by Pompey, bringing it under Roman control. In the conflict between Persia and Rome over the following 500 years, it was a crucial bit of real estate. If the Persians could establish control over it, they would have access to a section of the Black Sea coast and would be able to open up a new flank against the Romans. They'd be able to transport armies quickly through Asia Minor, or even link up with an enemy attacking down through the Balkans. They could even attack Constantinople itself. So the question of who ruled in Colchis was one that was of some interest to both parties. But before we look at that, here's a brief digression. Gibbon was a man of his time, and although he was very definitely a member of the Enlightenment, not all his views still stand up today as all that enlightened. You can find things he says that would nowadays we would probably describe as bigoted or racist. But there aren't too many of them, and you can usually find a way of excusing him, or at least giving him the benefit of the doubt. But if you want to find fault with him, the easiest bit of his writing to denounce from a 21st century viewpoint occurs here, towards the end of chapter 42. He describes the inhabitants of the Caucasus as being the ones that are the most consistent with our idea of human beauty. These inhabitants are in racial terms what we now call Caucasian. They live in the Caucasus. It looks very much like Gibbon was basing this idea on the work of his contemporary Friedrich Blumenbach, who was the first person to classify humans into the 5 races that we still use today. These have persisted because they do seem to be a useful means of categorising humans, and might even have some kind of biological basis, though it can't be long now until our understanding of genetics either confirms or disproves that notion. Blumenbach's work has been used to justify any amount of nonsense in the years since he proposed it, and quite a bit of out-and-out evil too, but the man himself didn't originate very much of it, and made clear that there was no hierarchy of value within humans. Indeed, he wrote essays contradicting the idea that Negroes were in any way inferior to other races. But he did single out the inhabitants of the northern area of the Caucasus as being the original human form. These were the people he believed were most closely related to Adam and Eve, and these people are today known as Circassians, and they are possessors of very white skin and often have fair hair and blue eyes. Blumenbach himself was more impressed by skull shape than skin colour, but the name has stuck, and to this day white Europeans and their descendants around the world are named Caucasians as a result of this work. Although Blumenbach can be excused from the charge of being racist, his work has certainly been helpful to racists. His idea was that the Caucasian form was God's original, and that deviations from this model were caused by the different environmental conditions that the various races have experienced since the departure from the Garden of Eden. His name for this process was degeneration, so the further you are from the pure white form, the more degenerate you are. It's easy to see how this terminology could be misused to justify the racial superiority of the whites, and we see the perfect example in the pages of Decline and Fall. Gibbon describes the region he calls Mingrelia in some detail. That was the name given to the country in his time, which was an independent country, though it was very shortly to become part of Russia. It has re-emerged since the fall of the USSR and is now called Georgia. It is mountainous, and while it has had gold deposits in the past, these were worked out in ancient times, leaving a people who have to cope with poor soils and the low agricultural productivity and sparse population that goes with it. He then goes on to describe the alternative income source, which was selling their sons and daughters into slavery. It isn't at all clear from the way he writes it whether or not this is a practice from the past or one that is still going on in his own day. It does seem hard to credit it going on at all at any point in history, but people have to make a living somehow, so perhaps it really was simply the only business they could get into. What is certainly true was that for many centuries there was a pretty big trade in Caucasian slaves in the Middle East. The caliphs towards the end were fair-haired and blue-eyed, representing the large slug of DNA they'd acquired from their harems, which got a lot of their stock in from Mingrelia. But back to the story. The region of Colchis has been a nominally independent but actually a client of the Roman Empire. In the reign of Justinian, the ruling class decided to try to switch sides for a better offer from the Persians. The Romans, needless to say, reacted. They sent in the troops. The situation escalated. At one stage, the Persians considered the forcible removal of the local population, which at that point in history was pretty much what we would now call genocide. You can't move whole populations without huge suffering if you don't have good transport, ample supplies and somewhere for them to go where they can actually make a living. What started out as pretty much a political power play by a few politicians had escalated. Soon religion came into the mix, with the followers of Zoroaster being deployed and resisted by the Christian population. The struggle between the followers of the cross and the worshippers of fire had nothing whatever to do with the strategic position of Colchis on the Black Sea, making the resolution of the matter still more elusive. In the end, the superior resources of the Romans prevailed, and the region did not fall under the control of the Persians. A great deal of blood was spilt, and, with the end result, it was all much the same, as if the whole thing had never happened. It does, however, have a sort of resonance. Not far from ancient Colchis, in modern Syria, a similar story is playing out in a similar way today. As I speak, Syrian cities are being showered by rockets and bombs from one superpower and being opposed by another. Arms are being shipped to keep the fighting going, while religious differences are being stoked up to keep the people motivated to carry on killing one another. The conflict in Colchis is long forgotten and was, in the end, pointless. I don't doubt that the verdict of history on what is going on today in Aleppo and Mosul will be much the same. Not many people take much notice of my output now, so it would be remarkably conceited of me to suppose that anyone will still be listening in 100 years' time, but I will nonetheless venture a prediction and offer some advice to anyone tuning in 2117. Somewhere on the planet, a conflict will be going on, backed by the superpowers of the day, China and Brazil maybe, and it will no doubt be portrayed as something of great importance, and many people will be being killed, while apologists for one side or the other will indulge in great and serious rhetoric over the issues raised. It will, in reality, be as meaningful as a male gorilla beating its chest to impress his mates. Whatever the arguments are, the correct policy is to do whatever you can to avoid involvement on either side. A similar bit of superpower politics was going on in Ethiopia during the reign of Justinian. This kingdom gained a temporary but nonetheless impressive bit of local dominance. It was able to establish power over the Yemen and to have influence across what is now Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. This was either the result of, or the cause of, support from Constantinople. Gibbon is interested in this because had the situation not been reversed relatively quickly, it would quite likely have prevented the emergence of Islam. Ethiopia was not destined to thwart the birth of Islam, but it did, and indeed still does, resist its spread. It kept its own form of Christianity too, and was the very last part of Africa to be conquered by a European power, and even that was only a very brief occupation, with their emperor, Haile Selassie, being restored shortly afterwards. They also inflicted a full-scale defeat on an Italian army in a pitched battle. The only other defeat of a European field army was when the Zulus beat the British. Ethiopia's continued independence became the inspiration for Africans from all over the continent, who latched onto its unique achievement in maintaining a genuinely African culture in the face of European hegemony. That they'd retained their own take on the gospel stories and a distinct set of theological propositions was all part of that. This was later picked up by former slaves of African origin in the British colony of Jamaica and morphed into one of the wackiest interpretations of the Bible story, Rastafarianism. Rastas regard marijuana, which they refer to as ganja, as a means of spiritual enlightenment. They particularly identify with the part of the Bible where the Jews are living in exile in Babylon, which has obvious parallels to their own experience. When Haile Selassie visited Jamaica in the 60s, he was met by a huge crowd of Rastafarians, estimated at over 100,000, who regarded him as an envoy of God. They filled the air with ganja smoke and music, including a song based on some lines referring to the biblical exile, called the Rivers of Babylon. Many years later, this song was picked up on by Boney M, who had a massive hit with it. It's a good song, if, like me, you are a disco fan, but it has one of the most impressive backstories of anything that ever got into the charts. The Rastas were not the first people to be impressed by the independent approach taken by the Ethiopian Church. In a later chapter, Gibbon gives a very full account of the later history of the attempts to bring the Africans into harmony with European theological thinking. These attempts failed and left a completely independent tradition. You can see why it would be inspiring to a people in a newly independent country looking to establish some roots for themselves, though the exact details of just what the Jamaicans did with those foundations were a bit less predictable. But they were on solid ground in their belief that they had a tradition that was at least as valuable as that of their white oppressors. The story in the Bible of an Ethiopian coming into contact with the apostles and being instantly converted and then sent off to spread the good news to his home country isn't borne out by any external historical records, but Ethiopia was the second country to officially become Christian, sometime in the 4th century. The Anglo-Saxons were still living in Germany and worshipping Woden in oak groves at this time. The Ethiopians didn't have an easy time of it keeping to their own version of Christianity. They had to fight off both Muslim and Jesuit attempts to bring them under external control, but it is just about possible to argue that their state lasted from the early 4th century right up until 1974, when a Marxist-Leninist revolution overthrew the emperor. With the extinguishing of that line, I think that means that only the Vatican can claim to be a state still in existence that at some point in its history has had direct dealings with the Roman Empire. I hope this episode has informed and entertained you. I've wandered quite a long way from a straight telling of the story, and I hope I've not strayed too far for your comfort. Of course, if I actually were a Rasta myself, I could blame it on the ganja. I may well have particularly disappointed Houston Post, who back in 2012 was kind enough to say that I was straight to the point and didn't waste words. Thanks for your kind words, and sorry if I failed to live up to expectations on this occasion. Next time, we'll be starting a new chapter, and a very challenging one for a podcaster or a YouTuber. It's an account of the Roman legal system. I'll need a lot of forensic skill, and there probably won't be much in the way of laughs to be had, but I'll do my best. In the meantime, thanks for listening.